Welcome back, everyone. We left off with this slide from Robert Mendelsohn. This is very interesting. I forgot to tell you this. This book was written in 1985, but way back in 1985, the manufacturers of the MMR were listing autism as a possible side effect of MMR vaccine. Let me repeat that. In 1985, the manufacturers of MMR vaccine, they were listing autism as a possible side effect of MMR vaccine.
Mendelsohn's work was more than 15 years before Andy Wakefield's discovery of the connection between MMR vaccine and autism in the late 90s, which has been proven and corroborated several times since then.
So remember this the next time you hear the mantra, the connection between vaccines and autism has been disproven. Really, when did that happen and where is that evidence? Here are two statistics that show incidence versus deaths from measles between the years 2005 and 2015. So the first is a source from CDC, that's your note number 190, and CDC's chart shows us that in that decade, between 2005 and 2015, there were 0 deaths due to measles. But during the same decade, there were 108 deaths due to measles vaccine. And the source on that is the VAERS database itself, your note number 154. This is another little slide that will never be in corporate media. Okay, so here's the setup. This is a review now of Washington State. So CNN picks up the story immediately from the Seattle Times, right? There's 39 cases of measles, in Seattle, right? CNN's immediate headline was, Washington is under a state of emergency. Why is 39 people having measles an emergency? As measles cases rise, now that was the giveaway when they said that. How did they know measles were going to rise? That's your note number 185. Right. CNN also immediately made it as hysterical as possible by calling measles a deadly disease when no one has died. Virtually no one has died in the United States from measles since 1970. What about measles incidence in 2019? Well, they like to confuse the statistics of incidence versus deaths. Always remember, we're talking about incidence. How many people supposedly got the measles in the last 4 months, right? First of all, the 600 or 700 cases in the United States, it's extremely over-reported. Did you know that in order to count as one of these 600 or 700 cases, you don't have to have an examination. You don't even have to go into the doctor's office. Some of these are done in county facilities by telephone. Since there's this impetus, this motivation to exaggerate it and magnify the numbers, this is an unreliable figure in the first place, over-reported. The second thing is, remember, CDC acknowledges that in the United States we have approximately a 95% vaccine rate. So it is extremely likely and probable that 95% of these measles cases were vaccinated. They never say that. The only thing they do is anytime that an unvaccinated kid gets measles, that will be blown up as a huge media story. Statistically, 95% of these new measles cases were vaccinated, and as we will see, most likely thing, they got measles from the vaccine. So, in the past few months, 600 or 700 cases, I say this, so what? What's a few hundred cases of measles, a mild self-limiting disease of childhood, a few hundred cases in a population of 330 million? Why are we talking about it? Did you know that in 2014 there were about the same number of measles cases in the United States but there was no news story at all. It wasn't being promoted. It wasn't being marketed. So that's your note, number 190. A few hundred cases in a population of 330 million people for a mild disease that requires no treatment, and you get better and have lifetime immunity after 3 days. Who cares? Yeah, so there was no agenda to count cases in other years. This is the orchestration of this year's measles boutique epidemic. Isn't measles a good thing? Isn't measles, it's the only way you can get lifetime immunity. Not just with measles, but with any infectious disease. The only way you can get natural immunity from a disease is either to be exposed to it or to get the disease itself. And then the body builds up its own methods of immunity about which we have only the most fragmented understanding, and you have lifetime immunity. The difference between natural immunity and artificial immunity. Now we're reading these stories about how they want to give every adult a new MMR shot because yours wore off, unless you were born before 1957, and then you have, by prior infection, you're considered lifetime immunity. So at least they acknowledge the existence of lifetime immunity, but what they're admitting there is that vaccines confer artificial immunity. Now for the bad news. For those of you, wait a minute, show of hands, how many people actually got measles when you were a kid in this room? Cool. Whoa, cool. Bad news, sorry. Guess what? That lifetime immunity, that getting that disease conferred upon you, sorry, but you may not now be immune to the brand new Frankenstein version, the atypical version of measles that has been distributed into the population from the MMR vaccine. That's a brand new disease. The natural wild measles disease burned itself through the population in true herd immunity by 1970. That's the little girl on the cover of the vaccine book. Okay, when you people got measles as a child, that was an immune building experience. On page 1098 of the Merck Index, we see that measles resolves in 1 week, requires no treatment. Your note number 173. Remember measles parties in the third world and in every place in the United States? You get the measles, your mother's friends invites all her friends' kids to come over so they can all get measles together. Lifetime immunity. What happened to that awareness? What happened to that level of sophistication among the general people in this country? I mean, are we devolving? Okay, let's get back to the safe and harmless mantras here for a second. How many kids really die from vaccines? Well, I started with the VAERS database. How many people know what the VAERS database is? So there's this enormous database, and that has tracked all vaccine injuries and deaths since 1991. You can still download that PDF, 2,500-page PDF today. VAERS is VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System. 3,250 kids died from vaccines. That's not an estimate. Those are actual kids with names and addresses. Those are real people. Here's the bad news. All authorities admit that only 1% of vaccine deaths or injuries are ever reported. All authorities admit that only 1% of vaccine injuries are ever reported. Here is the evidence for that statement. Ready? Fewer than 1% of adverse events are reported. This is, I mean, you can find lots of sources for this statistic, but here's one of them from the VAERS database. Your note number 150, electronic support for public health from HHS. So, if only 1% of vaccine injuries are ever reported and 3,250 deaths are identified, how many deaths does that mean? How many kids does that mean really died from vaccines according to the government's own estimate? Math wizards.
300,000.
Okay, here's another government agency, the Health Resources Service Administration. But now we have, as part of the VAERS system in 91, they set up the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So your kid gets injured from a vaccine. You file a case. It's very adversarial. It takes years and years to have a settlement. Since that time, over 6,000 cases have prevailed. They won their case and they got a settlement. The total amount of all the settlements of those people, this fraction of the 1% who prevailed, right, totals today over $4 billion. So use this figure the next time somebody talks about how safe and harmless vaccines are. That's your note number 151. Is MMR vaccine effective? Well, consider these statistics. Remember, what year did the MMR vaccine come out? What year?
1978.
Yes, 1978. Okay. By 1983, between 83 and 89, measles incidence increased 10 times. Since 1970, previously, nobody was getting measles or nobody was dying from measles in this country. So here comes 1978. Now by 83, measles incidence increased 10 times with the vaccine. By 1990, it went up another 50%. This included 27,000 cases, 100 deaths during that time. This is right out of Laurie Garrett's meticulously documented book, The Coming Plague, page 511. So, okay, nobody's dying from measles, nobody's getting measles. 5 years after the vaccine is mandated for everybody, incidence increases 10 times, then another 50%. What is CDC's response to that increase? Anybody want to guess? What is CDC's response to the increase of 10 times plus 50%?
Unvaccinated kids.
Nope. Yes, who said that? Wow, definitely not from a product of California education. He's absolutely right. A second dose was added to the schedule. A second dose was added to the schedule in 1990. That was their response. So that has persisted to the present time. And now, as of this day, kids get 2 rounds of MMR vaccine on the mandated schedule. All of this is in your textbook. I have the whole mandated schedule in your book. Does MMR vaccine work? That's a valid question. Here's what the World Health Organization said. They said this in the mid-'80s. Those vaccinated have a 15 times greater chance of catching measles than those not vaccinated. This is the World Health Organization who said those vaccinated with MMR vaccine have a 15 times greater chance of catching measles than those not vaccinated. That is your note number 175. Is MMR vaccine scientific? Well, did you know that the vaccine itself was approved after studies of 28 days? This is your note number 178. There's a recent story last month. I don't know if you've been following this, but there are some people who worked for Merck at that time, and they're coming forward. They had their come to Jesus moment, I guess, and they're like whistleblowers, and they're reporting they witnessed lying, false claims, unprofessional activities going on during the manufacture of MMR vaccine at Merck. That's your note number 191. That's going on right now. Please go to childrenshealthdefense.org and get on their newsletter, the atypical version of the disease. That's what everybody's getting today. That's what all these 600 and 700 cases are. It's not the wild measles disease that all of us had. This is the Frankenstein version. Yeah. The lab attenuated, man-made version of the disease. Why is that? Well, Because the guys who make vaccines, remember, they believe in the germ theory, right? So they're not going to put the wild measles virus in the vaccine, because if they inject that into you, they think, oh, that's going to give the guy measles. We're not going to do that. We're going to weaken it. We're going to dilute it to a certain point, which I discuss in the book. But the problem with that is, going back to your immunology textbooks from school, you remember that immunity is a very specific process within the body, very specific mechanism. Antibodies are very specific. So how in the world could a man-made, attenuated lab version of the measles virus possibly create antibodies in you that would protect you from the original wild measles virus? It doesn't make any sense according to their own science. Now, I'm definitely sounding like an anti-vaxxer there because I actually went into the science of vaccines, which you're no longer allowed to do. So vaccines create new diseases. That's not a theory. That's completely documented by the best science we have. It perpetuates not only measles, but dead diseases. So what they're saying is, if we didn't have the MMR vaccine in 1978, measles would be completely gone by now from our species. Not only measles, same with polio, which CDC admits, and same with pertussis. If we had no DPT shot, no polio shot, no measles vaccine, these diseases would be gone from our species. Not because I'm saying that. Here's a verification for that. I mean, there's many sources on this. Here's just one. This is your note, number 186, the British journal Lancet, Dangers of Vaccine Refusal, 2015. Measles is now 4 to 5 times more severe a disease than pre-vaccine cases. Quote, remaining unvaccinated in a predominantly vaccine-protected community exposes children to the most severe possible outcomes. That's incredible. That's from a British medical journal, Lancet. So they're telling us, see, here's the thing. They're always saying, the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated kids, right? Here it's proof that it's just the opposite. The vaccinated are the threat to the unvaccinated. And here's the science. When you ask people who say that the unvaccinated are a threat, when you ask them for any evidence, any science behind that statement, they have none. They'll call you names, they'll threaten to kill you, or they'll change the subject. Jane Orient, Dr. Orient, head of American Academy of Physicians and Surgeons, here's what she said. Quote, vaccinated people can transmit measles even if not sick themselves. It's kind of like shedding. Did you know that the CDC's total annual budget is $11.5 billion a year? Did you know that they buy $5 billion of vaccines per year? The CDC is not only a regulator of vaccines, they are a vendor. They buy and sell vaccines. That's your note number 141. Did you know that individual CDC members own more than 50 patents connected to vaccinations? The exact number is 56. Does the word conflict of interest ring any bells here? This is your note number 140, a legal website. I just learned that. This is something new. This is not in your textbook. So here is a summary of the vaccine schedule since 1950. If you were getting vaccinated in the 50s, it was 2 vaccines. If you were a baby growing up in the 80s, it was 20 vaccines. The 90s, mid-90s, it was 40 vaccines. And today, it's 69 vaccines by the time you're 18 years of age. We're the only country in the history of mankind that has a schedule like this. And like I said, most other countries, it's about half this. And also, most other countries, if you don't want to vaccinate, you just don't vaccinate. And there's no exemption forms. You just don't do it. Forbidden discussion. We're talking about media censorship today. It's not just with vaccines. Vaccines is just the beginning. Now, these new arbiters of online discussion, they can leave out anything they want. Any discussion of the scientific method even is now being restricted from Google. So what's that a picture of in the middle there? What is that? Where was that? Yeah, in Berlin in 1943, and there's the headlines, Nazis pile books for bonfires today. 25,000 volumes gathered by Berlin students, other cities to follow suit. What does this sound like? Do a search for measles vaccine dangers. Here's what will happen. Within 2 seconds, you will be presented with about 500,000 sites. You know, I live in Silicon Valley, right? Google is just down the street. You know, Yahoo is there, Facebook is right down the street. Everything is right there. And I remember in the mid-90s, I didn't get into the internet to the mid-90s, but we had this thing called a Boolean search. You guys remember that? Okay, some do. It actually freaking worked. You type in exact phrase or must contain these words, you know, and it actually prioritized it, and it actually used that as an algorithm, as a parameter to actually sift through the information that was available at that time and give you what you needed. Did you know that every 6 months, the amount of information online doubles? So we're talking about geometric exponential increase. Go back to the search you just did for measles vaccine dangers, right? Here's what's going to happen with those 500,000 sites that come up in 2 seconds, right? They're all going to have a one-dimensional opinion, conventional wisdom on vaccine. They're all going to talk about measles outbreaks in several states. They're going to talk about the unfounded connection with the unvaccinated. They're going to talk about assuming facts, not in evidence, like measles is a dangerous disease, measles is a deadly disease, the vaccine is a defense against measles, exemption should be outlawed, all these unproven things, and you will not find any sites that answer your original assigned search for measles vaccine danger. Here's how bad it is. All those 500,000 sites, how they got on that list is somewhere on the site they mentioned the word measles, somewhere on the site they mentioned the word vaccine, somewhere on the site they mentioned the word, and now they're all at random shoved at you, de-evolution of epistemology. Vaccine debate. Where has this vaccine debate ever occurred? Do we have social media or socialist media? Now, I just came back from Cuba, and I've been there before. Don't be talking about socialism unless you go to Cuba first. I've been to Vietnam more times than I can count. I'm going there again in August. Don't be talking about socialism unless you've been there and see how it works. It's never succeeded in the history of mankind. Now, today we have the new censorship on social media. Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest. Nobody wants to be left behind. Nobody wants them pointing the finger, calling them an anti-vaxxer, right? Excerpts from these letters. I'll do this as fast as possible. There was a guy. Who's Adam Schiff? Okay, Adam Schiff is a congressman, end of March. He wrote a letter to Mark Zuckerberg, who is the president of Facebook, right. Adam Schiff's letter to Zuckerberg. Dear Mr. Zuckerberg, I'm writing out of my concern that Facebook and Instagram are surfacing a recommended message that discourage parents from vaccinating their children, a direct threat to public health. Yeah, what medical school did he go to? What sciences has he ever had? And what authority does he have to even write this letter? It's totally beyond his scope, number one. Now he begins his enumeration of one false claim after another. The scientific and medical communities are in overwhelming consensus that vaccines are both effective and safe. 100% false. It's just the opposite. There is no evidence to suggest that vaccines cause life-threatening or disabling diseases. Do you ever notice whenever anybody starts a sentence with, there is no evidence that, you can be sure that they never read anything about it. Specifically, I request that you provide answers to the following questions. Does content which provides medically inaccurate information about vaccines violate your terms of service? What actions do you currently take to address misinformation related to vaccines on your platforms? That one I agree with. The misinformation is what we're reading every day. Do you accept paid advertising from anti-vaccine activists? What steps do you currently take to prevent anti-vaccine videos or information from being recommended to users? I mean, this sounds like Joe McCarthy in the 50s. It really does. The second letter was by me. Dear Mr. Zuckerberg, like many, I've read Mr. Schiff's letter very carefully. I certainly agree with many of his assertions that medically inaccurate vaccine information on many sites, the repetition of false information can be mistaken as accurate, and abundance of false information on both Facebook and YouTube, advertising revenues from purveyors of misleading information. The problem is the lion's share of this false information appears on sites that represent the marketing and sales of vaccines. Many of everyday media's contentions about the safety and effectiveness of vaccines do not stand up to close scrutiny of legitimate medical science. The irony is that the most valid criticism of vaccines today is coming not primarily from the imaginary demographic anti-vaxxers, but rather from mainstream medicine, mainstream science, and mainstream law. Perhaps the most alarming feature of Mr. Schiff's letter is his rather condescending assumption that you have a responsibility to be enlisted to promote his side of the debate. But here's the danger, Mark. Once you start down that road, there is no return. As Facebook begins now to censor vaccine information, you have new masters who won't settle for blocking only those posts that oppose vaccination. And will Facebook now submit everything to be approved by their handlers of the pharmaceutical industry? It's a slippery slope. Social media or socialist media, your choice. Okay, here's the third and final letter. This is better than my letter. This is by another member of Congress whose name is William Posey. And at the very top, before it's on a congressional letterhead, at the very top, if vaccines do not cause injuries, why has the Vaccine Injury Trust Fund paid out $4 billion for vaccine injuries? That's how he starts. Dear Mr. Zuckerberg, I agree with our nation's public health officials and federal agencies that vaccines can have life-threatening and debilitating effects on some children and adults. This is blatantly false information you received from Adam Schiff. The letter states, there is no evidence to suggest that vaccines cause life-threatening or disabling diseases. The Institute of Medicine, the CDC, and manufacturers all acknowledge that vaccines can cause harm to infants, children, and over $5 billion have been paid out to more than 6,300 people for their vaccine injuries, including between 500 to 700 individuals in each of the last 4 years. The number of children and adults compensated for vaccine injuries is 400% higher than it was a decade ago and 600% higher than it was in 1999. So it's going up, people getting settlements from injuries. As you know, medical science is not stagnant, that our scientific knowledge is always evolving. I have refrained from portraying the parents and groups who talk about vaccines as anti-vaxxers because that is a bullying tactic being used by individuals online and in media rather than an accurate reflection of the thousands of parents who are expressing concerns about safety and asking federal public health authorities to conduct higher quality research. I have a few questions for you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Do you believe in free speech? Number two, do you see the role of Facebook as a forum for open dialogue? 3, the letter written by Adam Schiff includes blatantly false information. Would Facebook ban his letter from being posted? 4, does Facebook accept paid advertising from pharmaceutical companies that produce vaccination? Of course it does. So you can read those 3 letters, one from Adam Schiff, one from William Posey. Mine is on my website under the April newsletter. Thank you very much for your kind attention.